1.1 million Australians in 2024 are living with an active eating disorder. 40% of people who have binge eating disorder and bulimia are men. Being anti-diet is probably the most radical act of self-love you can do.
Introducing Carly Dober,
psychologist,
helping individuals foster greater self-acceptance and well-being.
I've been working in mental health for the last 12 years. I am most interested in eating disorders just because they are so prevalent everywhere.
How do you actually ask or, I guess, be there for someone who is experiencing an eating disorder? Because it is a very sensitive topic.
Yeah. Keep in mind that they might get quite angry, which is why it can be very tricky as well. Be curious, be kind, be compassionate.
Do you find that when it comes to the role that social media plays in all of this, do you think that it stems largely from comparison?
Comparison is one thing because humans often engage in upward social comparison. Rarely do we engage in downward social comparison.
Do you believe that stress and emotions would be the number one reason to lead to an eating disorder?
Maybe you've heard this in the past. It's really difficult. Unfortunately though,
guys, welcome back to Chew on This. I am so excited for this episode. I know I say that before every episode, but super excited about this because we do have Carly Dober here, who is a psychologist. She has been a psychologist for the last 4 years and in mental health for the last 12. She's also a director of the Australian Association of Psychology. And I'm excited to bring her on here because there is a clear correlation of nutrition and your mental health. And I wanted to tap into just eating disorders, the topic of eating disorders. What are they? How do you identify whether you have an eating disorder? How do you actually overcome an eating disorder? The role nutrition and social media play on eating disorders. So super excited to bring this information and hopefully valuable tips to you today. So Carly, thank you so much for joining me.
thank you so much for having me.
Oh, of course. And you're from Melbourne, so Sydney day trip, long trip for you to get here.
Long day trip. So apologies if I look a bit frazzled, but I'm really excited to be here.
You look great. You look beautiful. So Carly, let's start by you just telling us a little bit about you, your background, and what interests you about this topic when it comes to eating disorders.
Yeah, so as you stated, I've been working in mental health for the last 12 years. I've always enjoyed talking to people, getting to know about them and supporting them with whatever strategies might be needed for them and whatever challenges might be in their way as best as I can. I am most interested in eating disorders, I think, well, eating disorders and trauma, but eating disorders just because they are so prevalent everywhere. They're an equal opportunity kind of mental illness, unfortunately, where everyone is at risk, and also supporting people to live more meaningful lives in healthy ways can be so fulfilling.
Oh, absolutely. Even just, our experience at EQ, helping people overcome a particular eating disorder or even just helping them build a better relationship with food, it is the most rewarding feeling to know that they look at food differently, they make friends with food, they find food freedom, which is, such a big part of our everyday, is such a rewarding feeling. And even myself, the reason why EQ exists today is, stems from my own experience with eating disorders and just having a negative relationship with food. So hence why I'm just super excited to bring you on, because I just want to shed light on this topic and also have people understand what it truly means to have an eating disorder and what eating behaviors are considered as abnormal. Because, to us, it may be like, well, I'm just eating this and this is a part of my day. But there are obvious signs, or maybe not so obvious signs, that can indicate that you may have, a poor relationship with food or have some sort of issue when it comes to just your food intake and the way that you perceive food. So let's start with just, diving straight in. What is the most extreme case you've had, and how did you handle such a deeply psychological issue?
Well, I guess I have my own private practice. So typically when people get to that really chronic or really severe case, they are either working with me in tandem with a psychiatrist and a dietitian, but it is more likely that they will be going to hospital and they might be hospitalized for some time. So I guess the most extreme cases are when people are either in and out of hospital and being treated perhaps against their will because the eating disorder is so present in their lives, or when they've just come out of treatment. But you don't also need to be hospitalised for it to be really impactful for the person. So I would say when it gets to that stage where it feels like they have no freedom from the eating disorder, where it feels like they can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, or they can't even conceive what their life looks like without the eating disorder, that is probably the most severe.
Wow. So at that point, so in these extreme cases, do you feel that these people can actually identify that they have an eating disorder?
Sometimes they can and sometimes they can't. And it is likely that when it gets to that stage, they have no insight into what their current capacity or functioning is. And again, because the eating disorder is so strong and it has just taken over every element of their life.
Wow. Okay, so let's go into defining an eating disorder, and what is it and what types exist?
Eating disorders broadly are when someone has a challenging relationship with food and or their body, and we're looking for frequency. How frequently does this occur? How intense is it? How many elements of their life or of their functioning are being impacted, and how severe is it? So when we talk about those three criteria, someone mightn't eat one meal because they might be studying or working really hard. That doesn't count to be disordered eating or an eating disorder. But if someone is missing a meal that, the human body needs to function 3 times a day or twice a day, most days a week or every day, that would border into disordered eating. Or if they're eating more than their body needs and they feel comfortable with and making themselves sick as compensation, we're looking for behaviours that impact quality of life.
So when we look at diets that exist, so you look at, fasting as a recommendation of weight loss and other health benefits they claim, would you say that's disordered eating?
I have my own vendetta against fad diets and things that kind of border on wellness adjacent dieting behaviours. And the insidious thing with trends like fasting is that very quickly, without support, these behaviours can border into disordered eating or an eating disorder, or they can trigger an eating disorder.
Yeah, because I was going to ask, so if you are making the decision to skip a meal, so you're like, okay, well, I'm planning on losing weight, so I'm going to place myself in a calorie deficit, because we all know that in order to lose weight, you need to be eating less than what you burn. And they decide to start fasting because they're like, that's an easy way for me to reduce. So for them to make that choice, is that considered as an eating disorder, or is it only when it starts to become very habitual and it's happening without them even realizing?
It's really difficult because I guess that the answer would change depending on who we're talking about. And a lot of these answers are going to be, it depends sometimes, so I'm sorry about that. But I think if it becomes a habit and if they're compensating for, wanting to lose weight or wanting to achieve some outcome, again, I think we have to consider what are health behaviours, what are health supporting behaviours. We know that our bodies and our brains need calories to exist, just to, be sitting here, not doing anything, not using my brain. My body needs calories. You're right, calorie deficit is a way to achieve weight loss. So that's a tricky one to pass out.
Yeah. So what does a normal day look like for someone who doesn't have an eating disorder? So what is that recommended amount of meals they should be eating for it to be considered as like, this is just normal? For
sure. So for your average person who's got a healthy relationship to food and eating, they will, wake up, they'll have their 3 square meals a day. Now, what they eat on that is going to be dependent on their calorie and caloric and personal needs. Everyone eats differently culturally as well, and they'll also have 2 snacks in a day. Maybe a bit more sometimes if they're more hungry, because our hunger will fluctuate depending on how much energy we use in a day. For women who might be breastfeeding, for people who might be training a lot more, they might eat a bit more. It's listening and responding to your body's natural hunger cues, being curious about it, and I guess not being distressed by it as well.
Yeah.
Not repressing it too much.
I do say this quite often in a lot of my talks, that having a good relationship with food is having no relationship with food, in the sense that you don't think about it.
I love that.
Because I find that if you are continually thinking about your next meal, or you're planning so far in advance because you're looking forward to something, it's different when you're going out to dinner and you're like, I'm so excited to go to, like, you know, Toddy's or whatever, like yum. But when you're just like, it's like breakfast and you're like, I can't wait to eat my dinner or my dessert, like I'm just waiting for it, or you're looking at the time and not allowing yourself to eat your lunch until you hit 2 p.m. It's when you don't think about food that I believe that you have a great relationship with food, that you just eat to fuel your body, to fuel your brain, to fuel, you know, the function of your body in every day. What are your thoughts on that?
I fully agree. Like I think about food a lot because I'm like, I wonder what I'm going to eat for lunch. Like, what could it be? But that preoccupation that you're talking about, that obsessive quality, is certainly a part of an unhealthy relationship to food and sometimes your body. And, you know, again, waiting to eat, you know, to a certain time, or just constantly thinking about food is a sign for many people that things might need a bit of support or readjusting.
I'm really glad that in one of your previous answers, you mentioned the two different spectrums when it comes to an eating disorder. So you've got the type 1, that is someone who eats less. And then you've got type 2, someone who eats too much. Can we just touch a little bit more on the person like type 2 about eating too much? Because I think that there's a lot of conversation about someone that is, you know, not eating enough, they're losing weight quite rapidly, things are not functioning as they normally should, and we can touch on that a little bit later. But I actually want to touch on a little bit more about the characteristics or the behaviours of someone on the other end of the spectrum, and start to shed a little bit of light on that kind of eating disorder. Yeah,
for sure. There are so many types of eating disorders as well. But if we're talking about two of the more known ones, you know, anorexia nervosa or bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, I guess that is, again, a preoccupation with food, or and I guess if we're thinking about the psychological root of it, often it is for people who are unable to sit with big, challenging feelings, like find it difficult to tolerate their distress. And in order to cope with stress or change or anything that might be going on in their lives, they might turn to food as a coping strategy, as a self-soothing strategy, and they will eat far more than they usually would, or, you know, an average person would. And I say average because, you know, appetites and how much people can eat can fluctuate and also exist on a spectrum, but this is far more food than an average person would be able to eat and not feel sick. And so it can be quite a shameful behaviour for them. You know, it's often done in secret where people will not know about it. And sometimes people eat so much that they feel quite sick, and they will purge because the body cannot actually digest all that food, or it starts to feel quite sick. So it can be really impactful, and it can also be quite damaging for health as well.
Why do people turn to food when it comes to soothing, you know, a certain feeling, making us feel better? Why is it that humans do that?
I guess, you know, if you think about the majority of, you know, Western nations, how there's an abundance of food, and food is often culturally a source of nurturing. You know, when we grow, the lucky majority of us, you know, will have positive experiences with food. Perhaps our mums or dads or aunts and uncles will cook for us, and it's, okay, that's a really nice memory. And for some people, maybe that's the only thing that they know that they can turn to if they're feeling distressed, or I don't know what to do with these emotions, I don't know how to cope, I'll focus on food. It's also a distraction. You know, maybe people don't drink or use other substances. Maybe they don't have other options, so they'll turn to food. And often it's something that's always there, you know.
How many people do you think are affected by an eating disorder?
Gosh, I don't have the stats on the top of my head, but I do know. I think there's about 1.1 million Australians in 2024 who are living with an active eating disorder. And again, there's more than just anorexia and binge eating disorder or bulimia. There's a whole host of eating disorders that are currently impacting, again, the health, the quality of life of all these people.
Are there any other eating disorders that are a standout to you that we may not be aware of that you'd like to shed light on?
For sure. I think one that's really quite interested me over the last couple of years has been orthorexia. I'm vegan, so, often I move in circles where there might be, plant-based people or plant-based diets. And this can also be with healthy eating as well. But this is when people, I guess, start to really label foods as bad or good in a different way. And again, it's that socially sanctioned eating disorder. Well, I'm plant-based, so I can't eat that stuff. But really it's a way to exclude or avoid certain food types, and it's entering eating disorder territory. Does that make sense?
So, yeah, absolutely. So when you have people that are on a whole food diet and they won't eat anything processed and they're doing it for the health benefits or good health, would you then look at that as disordered eating?
Not always. And again, it really depends on, is this impacting the person's quality of life? Do they have very rigid thinking styles about food? Do they have, if they were traveling somewhere, if they were flying from Sydney to Melbourne or somewhere else and they were hungry, but they couldn't find anything that fell into their safe category, would they eat to fuel their body and nourish their body, or would they not eat? That might be an indication that there might be something happening there. It really depends on thinking styles as well, and how flexible their eating rules are.
So interesting. I never really thought about it like that because, everyone has their preferences, right?
Yes.
So everyone has a particular taste that they may have or values that they want to live by. And I guess when you say it's based on their flexibility, when you're in a moment and you're like, I can't actually get the food that I would usually enjoy, but I'm starving right now, what choice do you actually make? Do you find an alternative that is just considered as good enough? It might not be exactly what you would usually eat. But I never really considered that actually being a type of eating disorder. That's so interesting. Do you think that the number of people that are affected by an eating disorder is rising, or do you think that it's under control? What are your thoughts?
It is unequivocally rising, unfortunately, and it's rising especially in young people. I think that there was a paper released in 2020 showing that in most Western nations, and Australia was one of them, that eating disorders increased partly due to the stress people were feeling. They had stress responses, so people were like, what can I do? What can I turn to? So that for some people triggered or worsened their existing eating disorders. We know that for people who experienced anorexia nervosa, their symptoms increased, unfortunately, as did those who had binge eating disorder as well. They were eating much more and purging much more. These are self-reported surveys, self-reported data. So that's quite concerning. And there are conversations and I guess data just cut that. I'm trying to think of the word, I'm going blank. There's research happening now exploring the role of the cost of living crisis and the stress that is associated with food insecurity and financial stress. Again, looking about how it triggers and exacerbates existing eating disorder behaviours.
Wow. So do you find, and you did mention this, that stress is one of the biggest factors to lead to an eating disorder outside of, social media and information that you consume online, or, even your perception of food? Do you believe that stress and emotions would be the number one reason to lead to an eating disorder?
It's really difficult. We know that it's a complicated dance between biological factors, so genetics, DNA, psychological factors, and social factors, what is happening in the world around us that can leave some people vulnerable to developing an eating disorder. So what might make you vulnerable might be very different from me, and what eating disorders we might be most at risk for might be different. But we know that adherence to fad diets or dieting is one of the biggest risks for developing eating disorders. We also know that Negative body image is another risk factor for developing an eating disorder, but a lack of coping strategies for stress is certainly an indicator that someone might be vulnerable to developing an eating disorder. And poor emotional regulation, so not knowing how to manage emotions, can be also a reason why people might be driven to, again, manage in a way that they are desperately trying to manage.
I want to touch on the body image. So you've seen a clear connection between body image issues and eating disorders. Can we touch on that a little bit?
For sure. So, body image is the interplay between our thoughts and feelings and how we feel or how we think about our body. And we know that positive body image correlates to a lower likelihood of developing an eating disorder, and inversely, more negative body image leaves you more vulnerable to developing an eating disorder. Body dissatisfaction will leave you vulnerable to trying whatever you can do to change how you're feeling, and that makes sense, right? Unfortunately, though, that leaves people, I guess, vulnerable when we're talking about things like social media, because Instagram's own internal research showed that people, and especially 14-year-old girls or young girls, feel worse after being on Instagram for more than half an hour. Wow. So, again, it's a very complicated world, body image and body satisfaction. But yeah, body image and how we feel about our bodies and how we think about ourselves really matters.
What about in reverse? Does disordered eating lead to potentially a bad body image issues as well?
It absolutely can. And I guess maybe you've heard this in the past. I know that I have when I've been working with people. They might have had a particular type of eating disorder where their body shape has fluctuated, and they'll get positive comments from people when their body shape looks a bit more desirable to maybe men, or they're more lean and thin than they used to be. They'll have comments that actually perpetuate those behaviors, and they'll think, okay, my body looks good now. I'm getting the most positive feedback I ever have. And then if their body changes again because life, or maybe they get more healthy, that can unfortunately sometimes a very challenging relationship to their body and poor body image, even though mentally in all other ways they're doing much better.
Wow, that's so interesting. Do you feel that an eating disorder affects as many men as it does with women?
Research has actually showed, and this does surprise a lot of people as well, but they've often been the hidden demographic, that up to a quarter of people who have anorexia nervosa in Australia are men, and up to 40% of people who have binge eating disorder and bulimia are men as well. And
Wow.
Cross-cultural research shows us that across the lifespan, there's no differences across the percentage of men or women who have eating disorders. So they've really truly been, I guess, the hidden kind of sufferers. And we know that marginalised communities, such as, First Nations people or the queer community, they have higher rates of eating disorders all up as well.
Why do you feel that they're not as vocal? Like you say that they're the hidden demographic. Why do you feel like men suffer in silence or don't seek support?
There are so many reasons for that. I think, firstly, men have been socialised to hide their pain or hide their challenges. They're meant to be the strong type where they can handle anything, and the only way they're allowed to, manage problems is with, anger or working out or strong things. Now that narrow view of masculinity is changing, and that helps everyone, but that has been the dominant kind of way that men have been able to express themselves for so long, and that change it's a generational kind of thing. And also, I think if we're thinking about eating disorders, often they're portrayed as anorexia nervosa. Often portrayals of sufferers are women, so it's seen as quite a feminine mental illness to suffer from. So there's quite a stigma attached to males having eating disorders.
Yeah, because as you mentioned, when you look at the eating disorder that involves overeating, 40% are reported as men. But we don't touch on that enough. I think that you're right. When we talk about eating disorders, we always look at those that are not eating enough. And we don't recognize those that are eating too much than what their body can actually handle. It's so interesting. And I feel like men can like just put down a lot of food as well.
Yes.
Like I know that sounds, like they just eat a lot.
No, my husband is 6'5" and he can probably eat 4 times what I can. And I'm like, where is it all going? But that's just him, because everyone is different. They have different caloric needs, and it can be very difficult to ascertain, is this an issue? Are you okay? Or is this just...
Do you ever just look at him and be like, are you eating a little bit more than you should?
Often. And he's like, I don't have an eating disorder. And I'm like, I'm just checking because I care.
That would be so funny, having a psychologist in the relationship.
I think he hates it sometimes.
My partner eats so much.
Yeah.
And like, I just look at him and he'll just like, so we've eaten dinner and he'll be like, I'm so full. But then like he continues to finish whatever's left on the table. And I'm like, but you're so full. Why are you still eating? And he's like, because it's there. And I'm like, it doesn't sound very normal to me. It's just like, I'm just eating the food. And I'm like, yeah, okay. So funny. So you've also touched on another demographic, which is like just the younger generation. And you mentioned about the statistics that Instagram has spoken about when it comes to social media and 14-year-olds. I'd like to know more about the role that the mum plays in, you know, children and their relationship with food, because I actually talk about this quite a bit because we have a lot of mums on EQ and they come to us postpartum. You know, they've gone through a body change, a significant milestone or life change, which, you know, they're then experiencing changes in their body. So they come to us in like looking to lose weight. And which is great because for us, you know, we educate on balanced eating and, you know, making sure that you can have family-friendly meals. And we talk a lot about the role the mother plays and her perspective on food and dieting and how her behaviours at the dining table can influence children's relationship with food, but even also how they pack their lunch, you know, what they say is good or bad and what's off limits and what they can enjoy and so on. Can we talk about that a little bit? Like how, you know, and it may not be the mum, it might be the dad or, you know, whatever it may be, how the household plays a part in just mental health and eating disorders when it comes to children.
I'm so glad you brought this up because this is such a common thing for people who are struggling with their body image or their relationship to food, and it's often through no fault of the parents. Like they're not trying to influence or harm their children at all. And I have a lot of compassion in my heart for people who have had a big life change, have had kids, and are just like, oh, this is a thing I need to adjust to. And then also parenting on top of that would be really difficult. Or also if you've had a history of eating disorders and you're also a parent, that's a lot to manage. So I'm certainly not trying to parent shame at all. But I think parents also often forget how children are just like sponges. They take in everything, hushed conversations, throwaway comments that you don't even think twice about. And they pick up on your anxieties and your stress, you know, whether that is about, you know, other people in your life, about food, how you eat, how you talk and how you think. All of that trickles down and it all influences then how they perceive food to be, what their relationship to their body becomes, what messages they internalize about how they should look or how they should feel about their bodies. So I guess my first gentle invitation to parents is really kind of assess how you feel about yourself. Do you need to get any support for that? Because it is really hard to change a lifetime or, you know, 5 years of thinking.
Absolutely.
You know, you don't have to do it alone. And also, if there is something that you're wanting to shift, you know, how can you start embodying and communicating the message that food is neutral, food is fun, food is not harmful to us? How can we start having a joyful experience around it? You know, how can your kids see you cope with stress? How can your kids see you cope with change? Because you can teach them so much about resilience. It is very difficult, but it is also really common.
And then what about even just food choices when it comes to, because as a parent, you have kids, you need to make food choices for them, right? They can't choose what to eat.
Or they
know
would
enough.
try to choose
They will.
chocolate all the time. Yeah.
So what are your recommendations for parents out there to, I guess, embed healthy thinking when it comes to food? What does that balance look like, you know, when it comes to packing their lunches for school, you know, even what they eat on the weekends? So what are your recommendations around that to help create an environment for your child to grow up making friends with food?
For sure. I love this so much. I think, again, having the spirit of flexibility. We don't want to restrict them from food choices because then they'll, you know, have that kind of unhealthy attitude towards it. They either will never want to touch it and they won't understand why, or they will go nuts on it. They'll binge on it because it's going to be a bad food. And what do kids want more than to have what they shouldn't have?
Absolutely.
You know, and that can really send some damaging messages to them, and it'll sink in really confusing ways. So I guess, again, thinking flexibility, and what I love about what you've done is that 80-20 rule. How can you embody that? What does flexibility look like where they understand, you know, the vitamins and nutrients that food can give us, vegetables, fruit? Why are they important for the brain? Why are they important for our bones? You know, why does mum cut carrot and like hummus?
Why does mum put carrot in every single dish that I make, that she makes?
Yeah, it's because she loves you. And also, these are the reasons why. And then also, what do we want to eat that's fun as well after we eat all that stuff? So again, flexibility is really helpful. Education is really helpful as well. But again, encouraging them to think of food as a way to care for their body. You know, how does this snack actually help me look after myself?
Do you think that there is enough education when it comes to food when, like, during our
School
childhood
years?
and school years?
No, and I think that's a real gap in the current education system. And I could say the same thing for mental health as well, because you don't really learn much about it. It's changing now slowly. But I think, you know, there's that assumed knowledge that everyone just knows how to cook, everyone knows about nutrition, and that's certainly not the case. Again, especially for people who might have had really difficult life experiences, might be from lower financial backgrounds. So I think if we're going to bring everyone on this journey meaningfully, it does really have to start during the early years, and parents and communities need to be supported.
Where do you see, or like what age, what is the youngest age that you've experienced someone having an eating disorder? Like, where do you find that it actually starts, or the signs start?
5 years old is the earliest that I've ever. I work with children as well, and again, there are higher risk, I guess, environments that children or people might be exposed to. So things, unfortunately, like dancing, like we know, and, you know, things like ballet or gymnastics, they can unfortunately still experience comments about their weight and shape. And sometimes kids can just be nasty.
And they don't realise it?
They don't realise it. But once that comment is there, we don't know how it's going to land for another kid or young person. And once that switch is flicked, it is so hard, and it does take a lot of work to get them back to feeling like they can exist as they are in the world. But you will have very young children who will just say out of nowhere, I have a role here, I'm fat.
That is so heartbreaking. Like, that is...
Yeah, like you're a kid. You should just be rolling around, having fun.
Loving your body as you grow.
Yeah.
Like, you are a growing human. You are nowhere near where you're going to be when you're like in your 20s.
Yeah.
Embrace it. Like, enjoy your food. Enjoy everything about you. Oh, that is just... I am so shocked. 5 years old. I thought you were going to answer saying like 12.
No, and
14.
even then that's too young, you know what I mean? But yeah, like it's not very rare, but it's also more common than people would think, I think.
So tell me, what are the early signs we can look out for? Not in just like other people, but in our own behaviours.
There are so many, and a lot of these things can exist on their own without indicating any kind of deeper issues. But I think, you know, if we break it down mentally, you know, how are people thinking? Is their thinking very rigid? Is it very black and white? Are things all good or all bad? You know, is their body really horrible and everyone else is very amazing? You know, what does their thinking look like? Also, very deprecating about how they are or food? Are they obsessed about food? Is it all they can talk or think about? Behaviorally, are they eating in secret? Are they eating with people, or are they not eating at all? Are they engaging in any of those binging or purging behaviors? Are they using laxatives at all, or skinny teas? Are they preoccupied with working out, and are they working out when they're in pain? Are they able to have days off from exercise? And then I think physically, again, are there changes to their body type or shape, like rapid ones? Have they lost a lot of weight very quickly? Have they put on a lot of weight very quickly? Are they yo-yoing in between? Do they have good foods and bad foods? Are they often sick, or often reporting that they're very cold? How are they self-isolating? Because we know that more often than not, eating disorders thrive in secrecy. Have they just dropped off? Are they kind of evasive about what they've been doing? Or, there are so many behaviours and things to look out for. And people will usually be very secretive about what's been going on for them, and they mightn't share it as well.
There was one habit or one behaviour that I experienced when I had an eating disorder, and this was on the spectrum of not like being fearful of food. And I remember that, and I never picked up on it. It was actually someone bringing it to my attention. I would always, like when I would eat, particularly when I would dine out, I would eat my meal a certain way. So I would eat around the meal, and then I would never, ever allow myself to finish the full meal. And then I would pour like my beverage on top of my food to stop myself from eating it, because I viewed it as, I can't possibly eat this entire meal. That's not right. But my body needed it. I don't know what I was thinking back then. But even just the way that I actually ate my meal around, or, separated like certain portions of my food on the plate, I never thought that it was any indication of disordered eating.
Yeah, rituals around eating or preparing food are huge, as are not eating a whole meal or eating very slowly as well, trying to drag it out. Wow. So, you feel fuller before you finish a whole meal, even though you're hungry. Again, it's not listening to your body's internal cues, or even self-sabotaging the meal so you don't finish it. Like, all those things are huge behavioural indications that there is likely disordered eating occurring.
How much, like, I know we touched on this already, but I just want to dive into it a little deeper. How much of a role does social media play in this issue?
Especially for young people, a huge role. And I'm certainly not going to say get off social media. I love my phone. I love being connected to people. Social media can be really helpful. But unfortunately, we know that it is very harmful to body image and disordered eating behaviours. And I think if you look at the rates of young people developing eating disorders over time, there has been a huge boom in the last 10 years. Now, if you look at socially what's been going on, the key main change is the uptake of social media. Now, there are other things as well which can lead to stress responses. There can be increased poverty, wars around the world, climate change. So there's a lot that is happening as well. It's not just social media. However, we know the data tells us how harmful it is, especially for young people. But it's also just for adults as well. We do have fully formed brains. However, if you're on TikTok, you could watch, 10 to 20 videos in a minute's time. That is not enough time for your brain to catch up and critically analyze what you've just watched. You're just kind of seamlessly looking at videos, and that information, that content, the subtle messages that content will send seeps in. Not only that, but the more you are online, the more the algorithm will show you what it thinks you are watching. So very, very, very quickly you will be fed, maybe pro-ana or pro-eating stuff, or just things that can trigger disordered eating behaviours or poor body image, cognitions.
Do you find that when it comes to the role that social media plays in all of this, do you think that it stems largely from comparison? So you look at these beautiful women online that may have been photoshopped or edited or whatever, and you have that comparison. You're like, I just want to look like her. Or for men, I just want to look like him. I want to have abs or whatever it may be. And that's where it stems from. Or do you find that it's the education that people are sharing online? Like, I, was on the ice diet and only ate ice cubes and lost weight, or I'm doing Ozempic and, all these, this is what I did to lose 10 kilos, or try this diet. Which do you think is largely contributing to disordered eating?
It can be so many different things. Honestly, comparison is one thing, because humans often engage in upward social comparison where we'll evaluate ourselves compared to people that we think are doing better than us. And it could be better looking, better lives, more successful, whatever. And rarely do we engage in downward social comparison. So comparison is a very normal human thing, but I think it is turbocharged with the use of social media. So that's one thing. But then I think as well, if you think about how everything around us shapes about what we think about ourselves, the world, how things should be, what content we see endorses a particular message. So if you have stumbled into the world of orthorexia, where you should only eat green, fresh things at all times because everything else is bad, then you'll slowly start to believe it, right? And that's your worldview then over time, especially if then you have people who are in the same circles as you doing that and reinforcing it outside of social media. That again, it's a really complicated and delicate interplay between, again, the mental, like physical and social components that leave people vulnerable to developing this stuff.
What are your thoughts when it comes to creators online sharing all this information about how you should lose weight or how to diet or what's worked for them? What are your thoughts?
Do we have another 2 hours?
We can if you want.
I think it is a slippery slope. I think we want people to share their stories. And again, that in and of itself is actually really nice, and it can be a way to connect people and find community and find support. That in and of itself is quite nice. I worry about people who have large followings who perhaps don't have medical or scientific backgrounds, saying that all people should follow this one diet because it worked for me, and we don't know what else they were doing because, again, life is often curated, and that's okay. But we don't know who is on the other end of that screen listening or watching that message saying, this is what I have to do. There's a lot of responsibility that content creators have, and with competing interests and everyone, wanting, I guess, validation or support from the attention economy, it can be a very, very delicate ecosystem.
So what are your recommendations to our audience when it comes to the consumption of this information online? How do you filter through what's merely a myth or what's factual? What are things that you should do or look out for to be like, this is accurate or this is not? Because you're on there. You don't know anything about this topic. How, what would you recommend to our audience where they can essentially filter out the BS?
For sure. I think, it's not realistic to expect that everyone can be an expert. It's too much labor. It's too much work. That's not necessary. But I guess think of your social media feed as like you are the editor or creator of your favorite magazine. What accounts make you feel good about yourself, right? What accounts make you feel like shit about yourself? What accounts are sending these flexible messages, telling you that life happens, it doesn't all have to look this way, things are okay. What accounts are sending very rigid messages, or I guess trying to sell you something and making you think that their way is the only way. And again, if we're thinking of self-compassion, follow accounts that celebrate, I guess, body neutrality. Body positivity can be really difficult for people. Like you said, people who have had children and they've got a new body that maybe is going to take some time for them to get to feel comfortable with. And forcing body positivity on people can actually have a bit of a backfire effect. It can be really stressful. So what are body neutrality accounts? Can you follow some anti-diet creators? Really think about unfollowing people that make you feel horribly about yourself and have a bit more joy and flexibility in your online world.
I love that your social media feed is essentially you being an editor of your favorite magazine. If you looked at mine, it's like food and nails and travel. I'm just like, I think like every second post is like a new nail inside.
You're like, yes.
Yes, save. Yeah. Take to my next appointment. But yeah, it's so interesting because even so, and to touch on the whole algorithm thing, I think my partner sent me something, like a particular recipe, and then I was just served the same recipe in a different variation for the next week. And I'm just like, I have seen these frozen sour grapes.
Yum.
They look delicious. Need to try them. Yeah. But just because I looked and engaged with one piece of content. So you're right. If you're seeing someone talk about just eating greens and that's it, and that's all you're going to get. That's what you're going to start getting served ongoingly now. And so in your mind, you're like, well, this is the way because everyone is saying to do it, but it's just your feed that's showing that.
That's right. And that often it comes up often with all things anyway, but that comes up when I work with men who might be suffering, bigorexia, that it's the kind of like obsessive exercise in order to try and, have that kind of the male body that they should have, like big, muscular, but also lean. So it's disordered eating in a like really poor body image where more muscles are never enough. And so if they start following bodybuilding accounts, then they will always feel like they need to catch up, like they are never big enough. And that will can sometimes lead to obsessive food behaviours and obsessive exercising that can be really harmful and difficult for them.
It's so crazy to know this because as like a female, you are always wanting to look thinner and, be more tighter, but you never really think about how like men feel in all of this as well and the comparison that they would have when it comes to just like physical size. So that's really crazy to know. So let's talk about the long-term effects of a person suffering an eating disorder. What does that look like for both, undereating and overeating?
Yeah, well, mentally, cognition will start to be impacted. So thinking will become much more difficult because they're either not getting the calories that they need or the nutrition and vitamins that they need. So decision making, their work might be impacted, their ability to make and maintain strong, healthy relationships might be impacted. They might self-isolate a bit more. And again, having an eating disorder having any mental illness can leave you more vulnerable to developing a future mental illness. So that the same thing is true for eating disorders. It leaves them more vulnerable to developing things like depression, anxiety, OCD. And if we think about the brain, it's a small organ, but it takes about a fifth of your daily calories in order just to do what it needs to do. So your brain will be significantly impacted. If you're thinking about your bones, it can leave you prone to osteoporosis, fractures, breaks, poor dental health, and that's for whatever kind of eating disorder or disordered eating you might have, cavities, losing teeth. Every organ in the body is basically impacted. You might be at risk of cardiovascular disease or cardiovascular failure due to lack of electrolytes or sporadic electrolytes if you're purging a lot or you're using a lot of laxatives. Ultimately it can lead to like kidney failure, perforated intestines, issues with, stomach and bowels, sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone and like libido, fertility. So many things are all impacted and ultimately it can leave you at a higher risk of dying prematurely or, having other health related impacts like diabetes too. So literally every single organ and functioning can be impacted.
And I've actually spoken about this. Not sure if it was on this podcast, but just in like to people in person about even just hair and nail growth. Yeah. People don't like the first thing that they think when it comes to hair and nail growth is that they need to take a supplement. They're like, oh, I need to go and start taking something to increase the speed of or the health of my hair and my nails. But the first question that I ask is, well, what's your diet like? Are you eating enough? Are you eating enough of the right nutrients? But are you eating enough? Because you're right. what we consume impacts our bodily functions, and people don't realize that, and how that plays a part in, you know, our hair, our nails, our teeth, our scent, how we smell, how we think, what our energy levels are like. Feeling fatigued every day or tired every day or having brain fog is not normal.
No, and the nails and the hair are often the canary in the coal mine. You know, they're a non-essential body function. You know, like the heart and the lungs and the brain. They're the things that your energy, your calories will go to because they are non-negotiables. But things like your hair and nails, well, you know, you might prefer to have them, but if they fall out or if they are brittle, your body will still go on, but they are often a really good indicator that something isn't right. And often also just things like the color or the texture of the skin, like how quickly do bruises heal for this person, or cuts and grazes. You know, is the body able to spare those additional calories and nutrients?
Yeah, so interesting. So I do want to ask a question which is like a little bit off topic, but it's something that's spoken about quite often now. What are your thoughts on Ozempic and its impact on mental health and just eating disorders? What's your opinion and thoughts?
Oh, it's really tricky because I think obviously it's a diabetes drug that has been shown to support people to lose weight, and often some people who might have been fat, and again, fat is a very neutral word. Some people might be fatter than they want to be. Some people might just have a natural set point where they're bigger than the other person. For some people who have been fat their whole lives and, or obese their whole lives and have been stigmatized due to being obese, and that can lead to, a lack of friendships, romantic relationships, being overlooked in work roles and stuff. For some people, trying Ozempic as well as having support from a psychologist can be really helpful, and they might be desperate to just try and see if this will be something that they can use and might change their quality of life. I worry about the addictive quality that comes with something like a quick fix like Ozempic, and how people who might be objectively like healthy people who might then lose a lot of weight very quickly and develop an eating disorder due to this, or who might have other health complications due to it, because we know that Ozempic for some people can lead to suicidal ideation or behaviours.
We know that?
We know that for sure.
Oh, okay. You need to touch on that now.
Yeah. So there's been research that has come from the United States, I believe, in which I don't know the percentage of people at the top of my head. It might have been under 10%, but up to 10% of people who utilise Ozempic will have suicidal ideation and who might engage in suicidal behaviours, who either have never experienced that before or who have before. So it's not too clear what's going on in the brain with this drug, but you think if this is being used by millions of people around the world now and millions of people in Australia, you know, are they getting support for their mental health? Like, do they know that this is coming? It's kind of scary.
It's so unregulated, this whole Ozempic thing. And that's what the biggest problem is, right? Is that if it's done in a manner where you have the right support from a professional, it's very different. Yeah. Because then you've created an environment and you're equipped with all the tools in order to ensure that you see what you need, because it is a good kickstart for those that are experiencing obesity, right? Sometimes you just can't suppress your appetite, and because they've lived with this their entire life. But if they have that kickstart, it's that little motivation to get them going, right? To, essentially build a healthier life. But if you're not doing it with the right support, it can be so detrimental. And because this drug is so unregulated, it is so scary. So let's talk about, sorry, just to keep going on about Ozempic. I know we weren't going to talk about this, but it's just such a hot topic, right? Yeah. And I don't think there's a lot of information out there about, the impact of Ozempic when it comes to your mental health particularly. So how Ozempic works is it actually can freeze your stomach. And then also it's been reported that it actually changes your perception of food. So you might be you might have a meal sitting in front of you and you look at it and you're like, oh, like become disgusted.
Crazy. Yeah.
How do you think that impacts disordered eating? Like, what are your thoughts?
I think I can't say too much about the research behind that because I haven't come across it. But I think if that does occur for some people, that they can become disgusted by food. We know that Ozempic isn't meant to be a long-term thing. People, like, I think a recommended course under a GP would be up to 12 months for people. But I could see people perhaps using this long-term, irrespective of the health outcomes or risks that might occur, because, how are people treated in the world when they look a certain way? It can be really addictive, I think, as well. But if it leads people to feel disgust or have that aversion towards food, again, that could trigger an eating disorder for many people, or disordered eating that, again, might be more trouble or more harm than they have experienced previously. And, how will they get support? Do they know what to look for?
It's crazy. When I actually, so we interviewed a biohacker and we spoke about Ozempic, and when he actually mentioned that to me, I just thought it's so sad to experience that and to look at food in that way, because food is, comfort, it's joy, it's happiness, it's
culture.
It's culture, it's celebration.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine life without having that joy that comes from it. Like, you cook an amazing meal and you bring people together and you see the happiness. You see, as soon as something exciting happens in life, you're like, oh, let's book dinner and celebrate. Let's go somewhere nice. And imagine not being able to enjoy that. You're sitting there and you're like, well, I don't really want to eat that.
And that's what we talk about when we think about quality of life, right? Because, again, if we're thinking of 3 meals a day, either with or without people, because not all of meals are going to be shared with people, but how much of your life then will be impacted by an eating disorder or disordered eating if you can't be around people when they eat, or you are so preoccupied with the food that's in front of you that you're missing the conversation and the connection around you. It can take away so much of your joy, vitality, memories. It can take away. And I guess when we're thinking and talking to people about eating disorders, we think, well, what is eating disorders? They pretend that they are controlled, but they are really always in control. The person is never in control. The eating disorder is, or the disordered eating is. And then you think, okay, well, what would control actually look like then? What would your life look like if you had a flexible approach to food and to connection over food?
Do you feel like people resort to eating disorders as a form of punishment?
For some people, absolutely, it can be. Definitely.
Because I spoke about this on my first episode with, when I went through just my phase of deprivation and fad dieting and restriction. And I look at it as a years of punishment. And I look at it as not showing myself enough self-love. Because if I truly loved myself, would I be depriving myself of the nutrients that it needed in order to function optimally? And so then I look at it as, well, was I just punishing myself? Was it torture? Was I just like, and I find that even people that are experiencing heartbreak, the first thing that they do, you see a lot of like heartbreak weight losses. You're like, oh yeah, a couple months later, they may have lost 10 kilos, 15 kilos because they're not eating as much because of the anxiety and the stress. But do you think that it's just a form of punishment? They're like, well, I'm not eating, like you subconsciously are choosing not to eat because you're trying to inflict that harm on yourself.
I don't think it's intentional a lot of the time, but a lot of the time you'll be working with someone and they'll say, I stuffed up at work. I'm not going to eat today. I don't deserve it. So for some people, it definitely is quite an overt form of self-punishment. And then, as you say, you're depriving your body of the things it needs to just function normally, not even like at its highest level, but just to function at like a really average level. So that can be quite scary as well, when that attitude is so tied into how someone will view themselves, like as something to be punished, not to be cared for, not to love, not to be neutral towards.
It's interesting you say that, because now when you think about like some conversations that people have, it's like, oh, I ate a burger today, so I'm not going to have dinner. I don't deserve to have dinner, or whatever it may be. Now thinking about it, it's like, wow, why are you restricting yourself from what your body actually needs? Like, and we're all about, one bad meal is not going to cause damage. Like, it is so fine to like, if you go off track and you go and you end up eating a burger and fries that you didn't plan or whatever it may be, or you had a few more slices of cake than you should have. It's okay. Like, don't try and undo the damage, because that will cause more harm than good. Get back on track. Eat breakfast like you should the next day. Don't do excessive amounts of cardio. Get straight into it. But a lot of people actually do that. And this is just someone that you would never think would have disordered eating. That just randomly says, oh, well, I ate KFC for lunch because I was time poor and don't deserve to have dinner.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's like, all right, well, you were hungry. You fed yourself. Enjoy it.
You may have not made the best choice at that time, but you're not making that choice every single day.
Yeah, and it's also like you listen to your body's hunger cues and you, again, did whatever you could in the moment, which is really actually good. So can you just enjoy it and then look forward to your next meal? And I understand that can be quite a radical shift, and I'm not trying to say it's an easy one at all, but we really want to avoid, again, that good, bad, I shouldn't have done this, those kind of like really rigid thinking styles.
Yeah, particularly this food is labelled as good, this food is labelled as bad. And, if you go to KFC for lunch, it's like, okay, well, that's okay. You just had chicken. Like, got some of your protein up, maybe a higher caloric version of what you normally would have. But it's okay. And just being like, it happened and I'm okay with it, and just continuing on life. Like
the continuing on, like I'll move on with my day. What are my friends up to now? Yeah. It's the moving on.
And not dwelling and thinking about it and feeling guilty.
Yep.
The guilt attached to food is, because I've experienced it myself, it hurts me to see other people experience that as well, because you should never have guilt when it comes to food.
Yeah. It's such a simple statement, but it is so radical for so people. And I would actually say that being anti-diet is probably the most radical act of self-love you can do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So just to touch on that, the whole anti-diet, what if someone wants to lose weight? Because like we look at, people are like, oh, well, I need a diet. I need to go on some sort of diet in order to lose weight. So if you have, one of your clients that comes to you and says, I'm not feeling good in my body, I want to lose weight, what do you recommend? Like, what is your approach to actually losing weight without it becoming or leading to disordered eating?
For sure. I guess like I'll do an assessment first to just like ascertain, is this bordering on something that we have to treat and be worried about, an eating disorder? If it is, then we talk about that, and we might also bring in a dietitian, because that is their scope of practice, or a GP if necessary. If nothing is needed and they're just like, I've had a few kids, or, my body's changed, I can't fit into my clothes anymore, I'd like to get back feeling a bit more comfortable. And, it definitely appears like there's no cause for concern. Say, okay, what's your game plan? How are you going to approach it? How are you going to treat your body and think about things as you're on this long-term goal? And, I encourage people, again, to think about how their body functions, to think about how bodies do also change over time. If your body has been a home to 2 or 3 other people as well as yourself, it's not going to look like what it did when you were 15, 20. That's okay. And I also encourage people to be around people who also reject diet culture, because we know how insidious that stuff is. And again, very quickly, losing weight might, venture into something else. It doesn't always have to, but just ascertaining how flexible are they? What is their game plan? Is the weight loss goal realistic, and does it still serve to be healthy? If someone who walks in and they're 60 kilos says, I want to lose 10 kilos, and they're quite tall, I'm like, hey, a bit of psychoeducation is really important. Your body needs this amount of calories just to function. What's underneath this? Like, what messages are you thinking? What is your mind telling you when you're coming in with this goal? So it's a lot of groundwork, but yeah.
So when you refer to anti-diet, what are you referring to particularly? Like, what is a diet to you?
Yeah, a diet to me is a kind of like non-evidence-based, restrictive pattern of eating over a sustained period of time that kind of sets up a person to fail, right? And so when you're talking about, calorie restriction, I'm like, all right, as long as a person's getting their essential vitamins, nutrients, again, flexible, not rigid, and they're enjoying there's no compensatory behaviors, they're enjoying their life, I'm like, that's one thing. But if there is a diet that says, you eat just egg whites 3 times a day, maybe 1 bit of broccoli, and then, a cayenne pepper tea for 3 weeks, and then something else, that's a very different thing.
I can't believe that still exists today.
I know, but I think there will always be space for people to be vulnerable to being fooled or scammed by fad diets when there is that pressure societally to conform to a certain body type or shape.
Absolutely. And we always try and find the quickest fix ever.
For sure.
Whatever gets us
who
there
has the
quickest.
time when you're, just working full time? That takes up so much space. If you're working and you also have kids, you're time poor. So that it makes sense. It's just unfortunately, like, if we can take one thing from this conversation, I just want people to know that fad diets do not work and they F up your metabolism.
Amen. Yeah. Preach that loud and proud. I'm an advocate for that 100% of the way. It's so true. And, losing weight can be done in a way that is sustainable. It's not saying that it's easy, because it's a change.
Yes.
You're making some sort of lifestyle change, right? Because there is an element where, if you are on a calorie restrictive diet, you may not be having, instead of having, unlimited amount of chocolates that you usually have, where you might have like 3 treat size or like half a block, you might be only having like one row. So there is an element of restriction, but doing it in such a flexible and balanced manner, something that you can sustain for the rest of your life, is so important. And people don't realize that. They think, oh, well, I'm going to lose weight, so I need to cut everything out.
Yeah. Or being really obsessive about calories, because, calorie restriction can sometimes lead to knowing about rough calories. And what we know about food anyway is the calorie estimates are estimates, to the best bet. But that can also lead to calorie counting, which can then lead to other things down the track. So you saying it has to be flexible, it has to be, consistent. It takes time, and I think people need to understand that as well. Like, it takes time. And again, your body has a set point. Find out what that is. And if you're finding it is sucking the joy from your life, if, you're isolating, you're not sharing things with the people in your life, then just always kind of checking in. What is really going on for you about this journey? If it seems okay, if no one's worried, if,
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember going through, my restrictive period and not having birthday cake for so many years. On my birthday. Birthday cake is so delicious. And
it's so fun.
How sad is it to blow out candles and then get served a slice of your own cake and have to say no?
Yeah.
That is... And it's not saying no because I didn't want it or I didn't like it. It was saying no because I thought that I couldn't have it. Because I thought that one slice of cake was going to make me fat. That is not okay. I think that one of the most powerful things that someone can ever experience is just having knowledge on nutrition. Just knowing what their body requires, what food contains, like how much protein am I actually getting? How much protein does this piece of chicken that I have every second day actually have? How many calories does it have? Like, when you have that knowledge, you can make informed choices. So when you go out for dinner and so you go to Grilled or whatever, you're like, okay, well, I'm going to have the burger and the chips and the sauce, and that's great. And for the rest of the day, I'm just going to make sure I keep it high in protein because I'm not getting as much protein that my body needs for that day. Or make sure that the rest of my week I'm just really hitting and getting more of those nutrients that I need because I dined out on Saturday and Sunday. So that I find that is just such a valuable piece of information, is that education around nutrition, because then you can actually make informed choices. And it's not about just counting every calorie, but having a knowledge of what you're consuming is so fundamental just to navigate through life in general, to achieve any goal that you have when it comes to weight loss, but also to maintain, and make those choices as, life goes on as well, which I think is important.
For sure. And like you said, knowledge about nutrition, when you actually understand what's going on, you'll know that if I eat a cake, the world still turns. I can celebrate my birthday and I'm still a healthy, fine person. Like, I'm not a bad person. I'm just a person in the world enjoying some birthday cake.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you think that society's set up to deal with the problem that we're experiencing now when it comes to eating disorders? Do you think it's set up to deal with it effectively?
I think, unfortunately, if you have a lot of money and time, you're probably in a better position than most people currently. So I think some pockets of society are set up well. Like Australia, we have an incredible health system, but not everyone can access it when they need to, and not everyone can afford it when they need to. And that's an issue. So I think also more people are becoming more eating disorder aware, and they're understanding that it doesn't present always with that one kind of prototype of the anorexic girl who's very, very skinny. Everyone is at risk of developing an eating disorder, and I think people are more aware of that. So that's really good. I do have concerns about the rates of mental illness in general going up, but also eating disorders increasing over time, because that doesn't look like it's changing meaningfully. And there's new treatments and techniques and eating disorder strategy plans nationally that are going to help more people. But to see that effect at a population level will probably take some years. So I don't think it'll change anytime soon, but I'm hopeful for the future. Yeah. I don't want to sound like someone who's just like very bleak about it, but I think I'm a realist as well.
Absolutely. What are some of the things that are being rolled out that will help with society?
Yeah, so practice guidelines from the National Centre for Eating Disorders, which are an incredible organisation that provide evidence-based practice guidelines for all health clinicians and everyone in society to respond, treat and manage eating disorders. So that's fantastic. It's, a coordinated response for everyone, but especially treating health teams. So that's really exciting. That came out only at either the end of last year or this year. So that's great. And like more funding, more beds in hospitals, more funding for eating disorder support services, more mental health clinicians. Hopefully that all makes a change as well. But yeah.
Do you think that there's anything that we can do, just us as listeners, to, I guess, create more awareness around this topic and just not feed into the miseducation that people provide online? Because, it's like at our level, how do we help create that awareness? What can we do? So, is it not engaging with, content that is all about restriction and deprivation and, and so on? Is it, talking more about it? What are your suggestions?
I think definitely not sharing and promoting pro-diet influencers or content, like, share and support curators who are talking about flexible ways of approaching food, because that is fun, that is sustainable, that is helpful. I think also be brave. If you are concerned about a friend or family member, talk to them, ask, open that door. Again, we know that eating disorders thrive in secrecy, so they might tell you to F off, they might tell you that nothing's wrong, but you've showed them that you also care and that they can talk to you if they need to. Or they might also share that they have actually been struggling and that there's something that they need support with. You're not expected to be a psychologist, to be a counsellor. That's not your role. Your role is just to ask, to inquire, and then to support them with finding the relevant help people or organisations that they can get support with if and when they are ready.
How do you actually ask, or I guess be there for someone who is experiencing an eating disorder? Because it is a very sensitive topic.
Yeah.
So how do you approach that?
With care, I think when you've said it is a very sensitive topic, you're right. People can often lose friends and family members because they are struggling, or they want to, like, the eating disorder is comfort to them. So they're not willing to give that up. They're probably not thinking rationally. They aren't able to, but keep in mind that they might get quite angry, which is why it can be very tricky as well. Or they might just tell you again, mind your business, I'm fine. But you are showing them care. And, hopefully one day, if they aren't receptive to the message, they will clock that and they'll come back to you. But I think just be curious, be kind, be compassionate. You can just say, hey, Amal, I'm always here to chat to you. I've been a bit worried about you lately. It might just be me overthinking it, but I've been noticing that you haven't been eating when we've all been out together. Is everything okay? I just want you to know that you can always talk to me about anything.
What about if it's on the other end of the spectrum where you see someone is maybe fluctuating in weight,
Yep.
they are looking a little bit more thicker than they usually would, you notice that they're talking about food a lot, obsessing about food a lot, how would you approach that? Because that's hard.
Very, very hard.
That is very hard.
Yeah, and I guess you've got to know your message, and you've got to know what your relationship with the person is. And I guess as a guideline, I actually encourage people not to talk about people's bodies and shapes, because we don't know what's going on for them. I might be like, a thyroid issue, might be anything at all, and we don't want to make them feel like crap. But maybe you can comment on the behaviors, right? Maybe you can say again, Amal, I've noticed that you've been talking about food a lot more than you usually would. Is everything okay? Like, I was listening to this podcast the other day and they were talking about some behaviors, and now I'm just like paranoid about eating disorders, hurting my friends and family, like just really come from that curious, caring place. And you might be wrong, but if you ask 20 people in your life when you notice something, 19 times out of 20, hopefully you're wrong, but maybe on the 20th time you'll be right. And it's, in my opinion, better off being wrong that many times and then supporting people who might need a person in their life than not saying anything at all.
Yeah. And I think this podcast has been really helpful with identifying what those behaviors are like, because you may not pick up on it because it may look normal because that's what they do all the time and that's what you've known this person to be like. But listening to the behaviors that you mentioned earlier on about these are the early signs of disordered eating, now we can look out for not only ourselves but those that we love, our friends and family. And if, we feel like it's important for us to say something or just even check in with them. Checking in with someone is so powerful. Just being like, you okay? Like, how's things?
Yep.
Like, I've noticed that you've been acting in this way, and never commenting on their body. I remember when I was like, so I started overweight as a child. I was overweight in my childhood, and then I lost a lot of weight, and then I became, that's when the eating disorders started.
Yep.
I remember that as I was overcoming an eating disorder, people were telling me I was looking healthy.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah.
And that they think that it's the right thing to say, but to someone who has just put on weight from being extremely thin, the word "you look healthy" makes you feel like you look fat.
It's kind of coded, right?
Yeah.
You're like, oh, what are you trying to say?
And then it just triggers everything again. And I remember going through that, and every person that told me that I was starting to look healthy, I was just like, you're telling me that I look fat. But that was not what they were implying, right? But that's how your brain thinks when you have that mental illness, when you have body issues, when you have an eating disorder.
Yeah.
So never commenting on someone's physical appearance and just their behaviors is so important. I'm so glad that you shared that tip. Yeah. So just to end this, what are 3 tips that you would recommend to someone who is on the verge of experiencing a binge? I know we've spoken about like the whole not eating and so on, but what about for those that have an uncontrollable appetite or have a binge eating disorder? Because that is more common than we think, which you would know. What are 3 tips that you would recommend to someone?
I'd encourage them to consider what other strategies they can start practicing. We want them to have a whole tool, a whole suite of things that they can turn to when they're stressed, not just one thing, but a whole bunch of things. And they might not ever feel as good or satisfying as that binge might feel, but maybe you try and call a friend up and you just have a vent. I hate my boss so much. He said this to me today.
I hope my team never does that.
Or maybe you try, dancing, like ecstatic dancing, or maybe you do something else, but try different things when you start to feel stressed, because often by the time a binge hits, the stress has been building and you just haven't been paying attention to it. Yeah. And then it comes to that point where it's like feeling very, very acute, and it's very difficult to not turn to binge. So try to get a handle on your stress, and some people might need to get support from a psychologist to do that, and that's okay. We often talk about stress management, that's cool. But also try intuitive eating, where throughout the day you are mindful as well about what you're eating, how it actually tastes, because binging is very mindless. It's just people often feel like they're losing control. Just try as much as you can, to enjoy whatever you're eating. Like, notice the taste, notice the texture. Do you actually like what you're eating? And then just be attuned to, I guess, your distress? What triggers it as well? You know, what's happening for you? What's going on? What are the things that make you feel like you want to binge? You know, just start noticing these things, because there might be themes or patterns that you've never really been aware of, and maybe you do need some support from an external person to support you with changing some habits.
I know I said this was my last question, but I do have one more. And I promise I'll wrap it up after this. How do you define a binge? What is a binge?
A binge is a feeling of loss of control over what you're eating far more than you normally would, and like an average person would, so a significant amount of food, eating past the point of you being full, and not being aware of really what you're doing when you're doing it. And then it's not often accompanied by a purge, but often it is, and often you can feel sick afterwards, and there's also a feeling of guilt or shame or embarrassment. So these things are really what indicates a binge, and that can be difficult because I'm a tall person, I work out a lot, sometimes I'll eat more than I usually would. It's not a binge. I'm just hungrier that day than I am some other times.
Just indulging. You're like, oh.
Yeah, I'm just like, oh, yum, more.
Yeah, more.
Yeah. But say if I eat in secret, if I eat much more than that, if I eat 3 pieces of cake, if I pretend to other people like I haven't been doing it, if I'm feeling very guilty or ashamed about it, if I engage in other compensatory behaviours, like I go for a run for 2 hours afterwards because I can't sit with what I've just done, that would probably constitute a binge.
Carly,
it's a distress, you know? Yeah.
And I think even just like not knowing how to stop.
Yes.
Because I feel that with my experience with people that have binged, it's, oh, well, I've had this, so I'm just going to go have that. Well, I've had a bite of that chocolate and the whole packet is still there, so I'm just going to have that and whatever's in the pantry, and then go and eat the ice cream that's available to me.
Yeah. That loss of control.
Absolutely. Yep. Carly, thank you so much. This was such an informative chat. I hope there are tips that our audience can take from this, whether it's what they can apply to themselves or support a friend or family member. So thank you so much for joining me on this podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this as much as I loved being a part of it. And like I said, I hope there are tips that you can take from this, whether you can apply it to yourself or you can share with friends and family, and even just spreading awareness around disordered eating and the impact that it has on our mental health and just the way that we feel and the way that we love ourselves. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you at the next one.